Hello there, this is Aaron, and in this tutorial I'm going to be showing you how to apply an image texture to the environment mesh that Finn showed you how to create. This is actually the same blend file that Finn was using, but I have removed the texture so that it's just an unshaded model. I am currently in the UV editing workspace, so I can see my model selected here with the UV here. Now, Finn showed you how to export your UV layout image. I've already done so. So here I have my UV image exported. It is a PNG file and it is 1024 by 1024 pixels. What I want to do first is, while I have this selected, I want to right click it and I want to go down here to Open With and go to Adobe Photoshop 2020. And if this program isn't showing up in your little menu here, what you can do is select Choose Another App, and you should be able to scroll through a list of the apps that would be compatible for opening this file on your computer. Just make sure that you are opening the file in Adobe Photoshop. Okay, so now that Photoshop has loaded, this is what you should have. It has our UV image on its own layer here in the layer hierarchy. What I want to first explain is why I chose to open the file the way I did. You see, I didn't open Photoshop, create a new document, and then copy and paste my UV image. I actually had my image here, right-clicked it, and I opened it in Photoshop. So this is my PNG file. The reason I wanted to do that is because of how UVs work. The image layout that you see here is exactly the same as what is inside of the 3D modeling program, down to exactly where each of these little UV islands is located. If I were to create a new Photoshop file and copy and paste the image over, there's no guarantee that these UV islands will be in exactly the same position, and the textures will be off ever so slightly. So just to make sure that doesn't happen, that's why I went ahead and opened up my UV image directly in the digital drawing program that I'm going to be creating the texture in. So now that I have my PNG open, I'm going to go up here to File, and I want to go down here to Save As. The keyboard shortcut for that is Shift-Control-S. First, it's going to pop up with this little window asking you where you'd like to save your file. Just for convenience sake, I'm going to go ahead and save on my computer. I'll go ahead and save it in the same exact folder. Now, before I move forward, I want to change the file type of the image I'm saving, because I don't want this to be the PNG anymore. I want to actually have this file be a Photoshop document. So I'll select that little drop-down menu, and I want this very top option up here, which is .psd, .pdd, .psdt. This is a Photoshop document file. It will allow us to make all of the changes to the image that we're going to need for our texturing process. So I'll have that selected. And I will go ahead and have this have the same name, just so it'll be right next to the UV file. And I'm going to go ahead and change this name to texture underscore environment. And I'll click Save. And another little pop-up menu here. I don't believe there's anything wrong with maximize capability, or excuse me, I don't believe there's anything wrong with the maximize compatibility setting, so go ahead and leave that selected. And there we go. This is no longer a PNG file that we're working in. Now you can go up here and see that we've got our new file name and it's a .psd, which means we can start making all of the wonderful changes to it to create our texture file. So what I want to do first is I want to change the layer type of this UV image. I want to make sure that I can still see all of these little islands while I'm creating my textures underneath. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over here and I'm going to change the blending mode for the layer by selecting this little drop down and changing it from normal to multiply. And I'll show you what that does. So first I'm going to go ahead and rename my layer just for organization's sake by double clicking, and I'll call it UV. Now I'm going to create a new layer by going to the bottom here and selecting this little plus button. Now I've got a new layer. I'm going to move it underneath the UV layer by clicking and dragging it. I want this layer to be called base, because this is going to be my base color, the color that is most widely used in my image. What I'd like that color to be is a kind of sort of desaturated green, like a very dull desaturated color. So I'm going to go over here to my selection area, make sure I've got a green hue selected, and then I'm gonna probably something right along here, just barely green. As you can see, it's pretty desaturated. I'm very close to this gray value border over here. Now, in order to fill this layer up with that color, if you don't see your paint bucket tool, what you probably have is the gradient tool instead. When I first opened Photoshop, that was the default tool that was over here, and I couldn't find my paint bucket tool. So how you do that is you just come over and you select your gradient tool by hovering over it. Then you click and hold, and this little menu will pop up where you, continuing to click and hold, you can move your cursor over to the paint bucket tool and then release, and you will have selected that tool. So we can go ahead and fill in our base color layer. I think I want it to be just a little bit darker, so I am going to scooch my little color selection down just a bit, and we will redo this. There we go. I like that better. Now what I want to do is create some simple shading in the environment that we created for the second level of our example game. I created some very simple shading that sort of conveys a little bit more depth and adds a little more visual interest to the space. So I'm going to show you how to do that first. What I want to do is return to my Blender program where I have my mesh selected, and I need to make sure I know which face is which. So the very first face that I want to find is the ceiling. So I'll select that. Now I've got my ceiling selected here, but I can't really see any of the rest of the islands, and I want to make sure I'm selecting the right one. So while I have this face selected, I'm going to press A, and then you can see it fills in that opaque face is the original one I selected, but now I can see the rest of them. So it looks like the second one from the top is our ceiling. So what I want to do now is create another layer, and I'm going to name this one ceiling. I'm going to go over here to my rectangular Marquee tool, which is basically just a rectangular selection tool. It's a fancy way to say that. And I'm going to make sure I have this UV island selected. Make sure the selection goes past the borders. I'm going to change my color to black. Select my paint bucket tool again and fill in that selection. Now I'll press Ctrl D to deselect, and I have the ceiling filled in. Now what I want to do is periodically update my mesh to make sure that the texture is going on the way it's supposed to. I don't recommend working for a long time in your drawing program without testing your texture to make sure that everything is going the way you want it to. But before we make this file into something that I can plug into Blender, I want to go ahead and remove visibility from the UV layer. Otherwise, those dark squares would show up on my 3D model, and I do not want that. So I have that deselected from my visibility. I'm going to go up to File. I'm going to go down here to Export, and I'm going to do Quick Export as PNG. And I will have it be the same name so that it's next to the file. And I'll hit Save. Now let me make sure I have that in my files. And I do. It's right here. There is my new texture PNG. So now I will go into Blender, and I'm going to change my workspace to the shading workspace. As I mentioned before, I got rid of that image texture that Finn was using, so I need to create a new image texture node. I'm going to press Shift A, and I'm going to select Texture, Image Texture, drag it to the left of my material, and I'm going to select the color and drag it over to base color. It turns black, it knows that I've got that image node connected. Now I'll go to Open on my image texture, go over here and locate my file, and there we go. Let's switch back over to Layout, and I will go up here to Viewport Shading and change it to Textured. And there we go. So we have the ceiling colored properly. Let's keep going. Now that I'm back in Photoshop, I'll go ahead and turn the visibility for my UV layer back on so I can see what I'm doing. And I want to get started adding a little bit of shading to the walls. As you can see on the environment texture from our game, the way I've conveyed a little bit of depth is by adding just a bit of shading, not only on the ceiling, but also blurred into the top and sides of the wall faces. So what I want to do first is go back over to Blender for just a second, switch over to the UV editing layout, and let's select one of the walls. So it's this one right underneath the ceiling, and I'm going to create some of the shading for the top part of this wall here. So I'll switch back to Photoshop. Now I'm going to create a new layer by going down here. I'll rename it Wall Shading. Now, what I'm going to select next is just the default brush tool. As I was doing tests in Photoshop earlier, I found that this tool is actually really nice and blurred. I don't need to do any additional blurring. So I'm going to select the default brush tool, and while I have black selected, I'm going to zoom in by pressing and holding Z on the keyboard and clicking until I'm sufficiently zoomed in. Now, to create this simple shading, what I want to do is put my cursor just outside of where I want the shading to start on this wall right here. I'm going to left click once, and be very careful not to click or do anything else until you've moved your cursor over to where you want the shading to end on the other side. I'm going to hold Shift and left click once. And it has created this lovely shaded like little gradient leading up to a fully black color. Now the reason I wanted the cursor to be just outside of where the shading would start on the wall is that, as you can see, it curves just a little bit when it gets around the actual cursor where it was originally. So now I want to get rid of that. So I'm going to go up to my rectangular selection tool, and I will click and drag to select. And to select multiple areas, I'm going to now hold Shift while I click and drag, and it should select more. And I'm just selecting all of this shading that is outside of the UV island here, so it doesn't impact my other islands. Now I'm going to switch to my eraser tool and go through and get rid of all of that shading. Control D to deselect, and we are good to go. Now we have a lovely shaded section. Now what I want to do is Control Alt and scroll back on my mouse wheel to zoom out. I'm going to make my UV layer invisible again. Control S, just to make sure that I'm saving my file consistently. Now I'm going to quick export as a PNG once more. And instead of naming this new PNG a new name, I'm going to select the old PNG that we are replacing, and I'm going to save over it. And when this little pop-up is wanting me to confirm that, I will say yes. Now I will go back into Blender, switch over to the shading editor, go over to my image texture and do Open Image, and I will select that PNG that I just recreated. Now we can switch back to layout, and as you can see, my texture has updated, and I got it right on the first go with the orientation. That's pretty cool. So now let's switch over to our UV editing workspace once again. And just to make sure I'm selecting the right face, I want to go ahead and make this shaded so I can see the texture. There we go. So we can see this is the one we've already done. Now I'm going to select this face here. And it looks like it is right above the ceiling. So let's go back into Photoshop. I'll make my UV visible once more. And instead of creating a new one of these shaded sections, I'm going to go ahead and just select the old one and duplicate it. So I've got my rectangular selection tool, click and drag to select. I will do Control C to copy. I will click out just to deselect that, Control V to paste that new little colored section here, and I am using Control left click and drag to scooch it up here. And making sure that it has all of the shaded area at the very top. So it's all the way across the borders of the island. Now we will remove the UV once more. Control S to save, and we will re-update our file. Yes, I want to replace that. Go back over to the shading editor, reopen our file. And looks like I got it on the bottom, so I will go ahead and edit that in Photoshop so that it is correct. Reselect the UV so it's visible. So I will first select my little shaded section here, and I want to flip this vertically across the x-axis, the hypothetical x-axis here, so that it is flipped in a way that it will show up properly. So I'm going to go up while I have this selected to edit, and I'm going to go down to transform, and I want to go down to flip vertical. And there we go. It has been flipped. Now all I have to do is select it once more. Control, click, and drag to scooch it down here so that it is on the bottom, or the top of the wall. Control S, we will get rid of the UV once more. Quick export as a PNG, save over that file. Shading editor, open up that new image. And there we go. Now I'm just going to continue adding these shaded elements to the tops of the walls and updating my texture so it shows up accordingly. Okay, so now that I have the tops of the walls all shaded, I'm going to go ahead and do the corners of the walls, which is basically the same thing, only instead of adjusting the little shaded sections vertically, I'm going to rotate them so that they are flipped, so that they're oriented vertically. But before I do that, I want to copy this, paste it, Control, paste it. Now I want to go ahead and merge all of the wall shading I've done so far onto one layer down here. So I'm going to select this first one, layer 3, and Control click to select layer 2. I'm going to go up here to layer and go down here to merge layers. The keyboard shortcut to do that is Control E. So I am going to now select layer 3 and layer 1 and hit Control E to merge. Now I will merge down once more, Control E. And I have all of the wall shading on one layer so far, aside from all of the sides that I'm going to be working on. This just helps to keep things organized. Since all of these are essentially the same, I don't need to have them be on a bunch of different layers. Eventually they will all be merged onto one at the very end of this tutorial. Now I can select this one up here that I've saved, and I'll go ahead and hide the visibility for the rest of the shading for the time being. I'll turn it back on before I export my PNG though. Now, just like we did to transform the shaded section vertically, we're going to go up here to edit, go down to transform, and this time I want to rotate 90 degrees counterclockwise. As you can see, my shaded section is now vertically oriented, looking really good. So I'm going to scooch it over here, just like the others, so that the shading is just out of the border of the UV island. And I'll do a little cleanup here. There we go. Now to create the other side, I will copy this and go up to edit, transform, and now I want to flip horizontally, which flips it over the hypothetical y-axis. Now it's facing the opposite way of the other one on the other side. The nice thing about Photoshop is that you can perfectly align things because it detects the sizing of the various things that you're selecting on your canvas. So as you can see, as I'm drawing, as I'm scooching this over here, these little pink lines show up that show me exactly where I could put this so that it's perfectly aligned with the other one. Super, super handy. Now I'm going to go ahead and merge these two layers just because I want to duplicate this exact placement for the other wall. So select layer 5, control click to select layer 4, go up to layer, go down here to merge layers, or control E once again. Select this, copy it over, select it again, and scooch it over. Ideally, I'd like to be able to align it with the other one as well, but I don't know if it will let me. I think that did it. Perfect. So now let's go ahead and turn on the rest of the shading. I didn't notice that the name of the layer had changed when I merged it, so I'll go ahead and leave that alone for right now. We could rename it at the very end. But this is looking really good so far. Let's make sure that it is showing up properly before we move forward. Always make sure to save before I export. And there we go. Yeah, this is looking really good. Now I just need to add the shading on the longer walls, and that part will be all done. And there we go. Now all of the basic shading is added to the walls and the ceiling. Let's go ahead and work on the floor. We'll switch over to the UV editing workspace, select everything. It looks like the only island that I haven't messed with so far is this one down here, so this one must be the floor. So let's go back to Photoshop, turn our UV back on, and before I move forward, I'm going to go ahead and do what I said I was going to do and merge all of those layers so that all of the wall shading is on the same layer. So while I've got the very top one selected, I'm going to go all the way down to where the last one is, layer 3. I'm going to hold down Shift and left click, and it'll select all the layers in between. And Control E. Double click, rename it wall shading. Perfect. So now I am going to add a new layer, and we will call this one the floor. And I want the color on the floor to be different from the walls and the ceiling, just so it is distinct. I think it would feel weird otherwise, for sure. So just like I did with the ceiling, gonna just dump one single color over the whole UV island. And what I want to do first is go ahead and go over to my eyedropper tool and eyedropper this color of the base, because I want the new color to be relative to this base color. So I just want to start off with that. I think I want it to be lighter and perhaps a little bit less saturated. So I'm going to go scooch my little guy up just like that. Now we'll go over to the paint bucket and fill it up. And Control D. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of the UV just to see a little better the difference between the base and this new color here. I think it could stand to be just a bit lighter. So I'm going to undo a couple of times until I just have this selected and I haven't filled it with color yet. And I'm going to increase the brightness just a little bit more of this color. And there we go. Control D to deselect, get rid of the UV. That's looking better. That has a higher contrast, so it'll show up a little nicer. Okay, so I'm going to put that back on. And now, just like I did with the walls and the ceiling, I'm going to add a little simple shading to the floor too. So I will go up to add a new layer, and I will select again my brush tool. And I don't want it to be black this time, because the shading, if it were black on the floor with this lighter color, that would be just a little bit too much, especially when the same blackness is on the darker walls. It just wouldn't look quite right. So while I have that lighter color that I've already used to fill the floor section selected, I'm going to go ahead and just drop the value and scooch the opacity over just slight, and scooch the saturation slightly so that it's just a little bit greener and just a little bit darker. Not a whole bunch darker, not a whole bunch greener, but enough that it's noticeable. And we will see how it looks. So just like before, I'm actually going to zoom in first. Not quite that much. I'm going to go ahead and, with my brush, left click just outside the border, bring it over here, hold down Shift, left click again. And there we go. We've got some simple shading. I definitely think this could stand to be a little bit darker, so I am going to go ahead and undo all of that, switch my color so that it is just a bit darker, and a little more saturated as well, and do the same thing. There we go. I like how that shows up much better. And I'm not going to be as picky with the floor as I was with the walls, with making everything super even, just because it's one plane, as opposed to aligning a bunch of them and making them all look the same. So I'm just going to manually brush in the rest of this shading. And there we go. Now let's do a little cleanup. I guess this part isn't strictly necessary, at least on the bottom area where the shading isn't interacting, but I just like everything to be nice and clean, so we'll erase all of it. Okay, so now all of our areas are shaded. Okay, so now we have all of our shading. Let's double check that everything looks okay on our 3D model. Okay, so I obviously can't see the floor unless I flip down like that, or I zoom in just a little bit like this so that I'm actually inside of the cube. And now I can see that, yeah, things are starting to look quite nice. This is starting to feel like a real space. So let's keep going. What I'd like to do next is add some tile textures so that it looks, you know, a little bit more realistic, like a real space that you would be in, and not just blank, smooth walls. So what I'm going to do first is open up a new tab and search for tile texture. A lot of the time you can find resources like this on Google Images that are free to use. Here we go. Here's one that looks nice. I think I'll use this one for the floor maybe. Here's one that looks nice. I think I'll use this one on the floor maybe. So now that I've found one that I like, I'm going to go ahead and right click it and go to Open Image in New Tab so that I have just the image. Right click it, copy, and I want to paste it over on top of all of these layers. It's fine if the UV layer is on top of it, but I want to make sure that all the other layers are underneath so that they are affected by it essentially. So Control V to paste, and since this one's going on the floor, I don't want the tiles to show up quite so large. They would be very, very big if I left this square at the scale that it currently is. So what I want to do is rectangle select, go up to Edit, Transform, and Scale. And these awesome little bounding boxes are going to show up that we can use to manipulate our image. Now I'm going to use the upper right one. As long as you're doing one of the corners, it doesn't really matter which. But I am going to hold down the Shift key, click and drag until this scales down, just like that. Until it is a good size that I like. And then I'll hit enter. And there we go. We have a much smaller little tile image here. What I'd like to do is get them to tile as evenly as possible on each other. So all I'm going to do is select it, copy it, and paste it. And we are going to start just working these images together. Just like that. To make things easier on myself, the larger my selection gets here, or rather, the larger my 2 or however many cubes get, I'm going to merge the layers so that I can copy the larger section and just get this done a little bit quicker. Go ahead and pop that UV back on so I know where my boundaries are. Now, since this set of tiles is now roughly the same dimensions as my UV island, I'm going to go ahead and scale it up just a little bit so that I don't have to keep copying and pasting. Just like before, I'm holding down Shift while I manipulate the bounding boxes so that I can preserve the original aspect ratio. Hit enter, and there we go. Now we have this awesome tile texture. I will go ahead and change my layer type of the tile to multiply, and check that out. That looks really nice. Okay, Control S. Let's see how that looks on our 3D model. Yeah, that's looking really good. I really like that. Okay, so now that we've got a tile texture added to the floor, let's add a new one to the walls. So let's go back to the image search and check out our other tile options. I want the tiles on the walls to be different. I'd like them to be larger, ideally. One nice thing that you can do on Google Images that I didn't know about until recently is that if you're finding one thing that you kind of like, but it's not quite right, and you keep scrolling and scrolling and you don't find anything similar, well, what you can do is you can click on the one that you kind of like, and a bunch of other similar options will pop up. And that can be a really big help to cut down on the search time. I was hoping to get some more horizontal tiles, but honestly, I could probably just make my own from one of these. Let's go ahead and find one that I feel like I can manipulate easily. This one should do. I'll copy that and bring it on into Photoshop. Just like before, I want to make sure that it is above all the other layers so that they can be affected by it. Now this one is quite large, so I'm going to have to, without selecting anything, I'm going to go to Scale, and I have it on this layer, and it automatically selects everything on that layer. That way I don't have to manually rectangle select. Okay, I'm going to get rid of the UV just for right now. Now what I want to do is I want to make this a little bit stretched out horizontally, or excuse me, vertically. so that the tiles are just a little bit longer. So I will go back to transform and scale. And instead of holding down shift this time, I'm just gonna click this top one and stretch it out. That looks good. Press enter. We'll reselect it. And let's scale it back down. Holding shift again because I like this aspect ratio. And this looks good. Maybe just a little bit smaller so I can fit 3 on each wall. Excuse me, 3 rows on each wall. Okay, I think that should do it. So now, just like before, I'm going to copy this tile texture until it looks the way I want it to. Oh wow, Photoshop. That is above and beyond. I don't know if you noticed that, but Photoshop is actually detecting the lines in the tile images, and it's helping me align these images properly. That is super helpful, Photoshop. Thank you. Merge these 2 layers. And I will cover all of the walls with this new tile texture. Okay, so now that all of the tiles are positioned over the UV islands, I do want to do just some small adjustments. First, I'm going to go ahead and merge those layers. And I wanted to make it so that the textures on the walls just a little bit more even in the middle here. There we go. And this one as well. There we go. I'm going to erase just a little bit more just to be careful of this border. Okay, so now we can change the layer type of this tile to multiply as well. And there we go. Ah, yeah, that's looking really good so far. Just to keep everything organized, I want to rename these layers here floor tiles and wall tiles. I'll merge these two. Floor. And rename this one floor shading. Control S to save. Get rid of the UV. And let's see how it looks. Ah, yeah, look at that. This environment is really starting to come together. So now that we have our tiles on the wall and the floor, there's really only one more thing that I wanted to add to the environment. And that was some points of interest. So what I mean by that is that when you're looking around this, environment, it looks really good. Like, considering where we started off, I think this is looking much better. However, it's still just a little bit sterile, just a little bit boring. There's not a whole bunch of personality in here, not a lot that's unique about it. So what I want to do by adding some points of interest is by essentially, adding little things to it to make it a little bit more unique. In the original texture for the level 2 environment, what I did was I added some holes in the walls and missing tiles with exposed pipes and wiring. Just for the sake of time in this tutorial, all I'm going to show you how to do is just show you how to remove a few tiles, which should definitely add some visual interest to this guy. Alright, so what I want to do first in Photoshop is create a new layer, and we are going to call this tile holes. Okay. Now the nice thing about tiles is that they're perfectly square. So this is going to be pretty easy. What I want to do is on just here and there throughout the walls, I think I'll leave the floor alone, but throughout the walls I'm going to add just a few little holes here and there following the border of those tiles so that it makes sense. I'm going to grab my brush and make sure I've got black selected and start coloring in these various holes. All right, yeah, check that out. So now our environment is fully textured, and we added some simple shading, some tile textures, and a few missing tiles just to give it a little visual interest. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I hope it was helpful for you. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.